Engines wound tight against noon heat, a raw metal hum riding over a strip that was barely coral dust nailed to jungle. Crosswind slid off the ridge and shouldered the C-47 sideways. The nose bobbed as Lieutenant Raymond Cole held it square, the airspeed needle twitching like a wary eye. Palm fronds along the boundary leaned into the prop wash, dust lifting in veils that made the world sepia. Ahead was no horizon, only a green wall, mangrove and banyan fused to a single mass that gave no promise of sky. Ground crews flattened themselves as the aircraft rumbled past a bone-white crater that had stolen 300 feet and dared them to try anyway. The radio hissed a clipped now or never, and above the trees thin gray puffs marked artillery, feeling for the strip, range bracketing closing by the minute. In the cockpit, Cole slid his palm over the throttles until the detents kissed. The Pratt & Whitneys answered like muscle, put on notice. Weight sat stubborn, 29,000 pounds with cargo slung aft into that 2-inch CG nobody wanted, 10% over the paper that kept safe people safe. He locked his gaze down the strip and refused to bring it back. "Committed," he said to the windshield, because this field did not allow half measures. Past midfield, abort wasn't a word, it was a report. Quartering wind bit from the right and tried to twist the nose. The rudder fought it with a hiss, and the force changed its mind every 3 seconds. They'd stacked the last load with engine heat already shimmering the cabin like a mirage. A stretcher with a sallow-faced radio man went in aft. His life hung from Maeve Rourke's careful hands, an IV line that made the cabin quiet in a way gunfire didn't. A crate of morphine, sulfa, and glass went wherever it could bite into netting instead of reason, and 2 ammunition tins slid forward when the crew chief hauled the webbing and called it good. That aft creep was arithmetic with teeth. The nose would want to leap before the legs were ready. Cole felt it in the yoke, light where it should be heavy, rotation eager enough to promise lift and stall in the same breath. Sergeant Hideo Tanaka's knuckles were pale on the throttles before takeoff even had a shape. He'd set the cowl flaps wider than the book for this heat. Cylinder heads didn't care what manuals said, and on this island, numbers ran hot. His eyes bounced. Oil pressure, cylinder head temp, fuel flow, then the small mirror screwed to the windscreen post, a poor man's periscope, showed black-green jungle grinding up against their periphery. He kept his mouth shut. The instruments told truth enough, and Cole needed the seat's feel more than any comment. The smell braided raw fuel with hot oil and sap and salt, the perfume of motion that meant now or wrong. The artillery found a new beat. Thin puffs climbed over the tree line, a patient hand adjusting range. Somewhere beyond the mangroves, someone was reading the strip's rhythm and penciling corrections. Waiting for a cooler hour would be waiting for math to finish. Rourke pressed the radio to her ear and watched the radio man's face go waxy, listened for Guadalcanal, and got salt static, half a word from tower, half a prayer from nobody. The jungle twitched at the boundary, wind or intent, and her clock ticked the triple, weather, blood, enemy. Air under the mains got lumpy as the crosswind licked hotter, a pale gust snaking down from the ridge and rolling the length at treetop height. The ship stepped left like the runway had turned to greased tin. Cole fed right rudder until his foot burned and felt the tail drag through the gust in a stutter. The left main hammered a rut left over from rain and last week's crater work, the jolt ringing up the leg and into his spine like a struck bell. The wing dipped left, then lower, treetops whispering to aluminum, and for a fraction the world narrowed to one wheel, one wing, one green wall. The slice came like a paper cut, small insult, large meaning. A dull scythe, not a scream. A wet slap of leaf and twig, a whip of fronds smacking the windscreen and clinging. The left leading edge bit into soft canopy and stole trophies. Fronds, bark, sap spatters that stuck to oil like glue. A private barked a laugh that was fear's little brother. Cole didn't look. He felt the part that mattered. The yoke went light, then heavy in a stupid rhythm. The needle shed a knot as if he'd grabbed a brake, and the rudder asked for a conversation he hadn't planned to start this early. Rotation stopped being a decision. It was reflex. 78 knots and a sliver more, the deck pressed up through the wheels like a tide, and Cole lifted the nose into the narrow slice of air the gusts left. The tail came up against drag that hadn't been there a heartbeat earlier, and the ship rode its own wash like a bad raft. He refused the climb, not yet. He dragged the airplane into ground effect, 5 to 10 feet above mangrove and coral grit, and hung there, cheating physics with proximity. When Tanaka brushed the flap lever out of habit and brought it back to neutral, the right retracted, the left sulked. Something in that wing said no, and the airplane listed like a bucket heavy on one side. The strip fell away in a bruise of dust. They shaved treetops so close, leaves ripped to streamers, and trailed green-black behind the wing. The engines worked harder than their hours justified, harmonics not perfectly married, a roughness at 2,400 RPM that was more than mixture. Cole held the nose down and fed speed the way a starving man eats, patient and fierce. 87 crept to 90. It hung, then grudged 91. He adjusted in whispers, yoke, trim, a fingertip of throttle, and resisted the big man urge to yank. Ask the wing for too much, and the mangroves would oblige with an answer in bark. Rourke's headset spit a string of Guadalcanal that broke on weather, syllables chewed by cloud, building their own agendas over water. Clee, straight, winds, T, was all she dug out, which could mean calm or cross or nothing when you're living on a sponge of air. She looked left and saw leaves beating where metal should be smooth, green darkening under oil into an obscene decoration. The radio man blinked awake long enough to say, "Trees?" Like the canopy was under and over them at once. Tanaka leaned to read through his boot soles and felt a vibration that wasn't engine, wasn't prop. A flapping beat lived outboard, out of sync with machine rhythm. He craned for the side window and saw it. A twig jammed into the left flap track like a jungle splint. The flap root shivered with a frequency Wichita hadn't blessed. He jabbed down and forward, there, stuck, an engineer's pointed sentence. Cole didn't look. Eyes on the greasy, glittering ribbon 10 feet below paid better. He pushed more right rudder, countered the left wing's drag with leg and intent, and eased into a crab that matched the wind's bad mood. The left cylinder head temp jumped 30 degrees in 30 seconds. Tanaka cracked the left cowl flap wider, even knowing it would drag like a barn door and eat airspeed and fuel. He chose engine overspeed by a hair because a cooked Pratt ends conversations. The needle halted a tick shy of the red. The airspeed punished it, 92 wobbling, then 91, refusing clean. The fuel gauge, topped off from blue drums with a sheen and no strainer, jiggled lower like a raised eyebrow. Guadalcanal lay somewhere through green and blue, coral runway mythic at this altitude, but weather stacked like old cards, gray rampart thickening while heat built inland thunderheads. The crosswind had become habit, sustained 12 to 15 knots off the right quarter, with punches whenever hot met cool over treetops. Cole tasted salt, felt sweat under his goggles, and did the density-altitude math. 2,000 feet here, behaved taller, climb rate half what cheerful manuals promised. He kept them in ground effect longer than his nerves liked, stealing speed from the planet and paying it back in patience. Mangroves gave way to tidal flats that flashed like broken glass, then to white surf lines. A dragonfly splatted on the windscreen, wings beating a pain, knuckled by storms. The ship found a course balance where wrongs canceled wrongs to make forward progress that looked like skill and felt like luck. Rourke checked the radio man's breath. The deck swayed left-right, one side of the airplane working harder to be an airplane. Base, Transport 4-1, airborne with 1 wounded, fuel 400, correction 380, request vector, she called. The ocean answered before the tower had a chance. Cole's judgment sat in the thin strip between stubborn and careful, thinner than the bruised wing skin. Hold here in wishful climb, and the left engine would cook while fuel bled into arithmetic he didn't want. Turn back to the strip that had tried to catch them and line up with craters and bulldozers under an enemy observer's eye. He lowered the nose 1 degree, a confession to gravity for speed, then stole a shallow climb from that gift. He said nothing because words carry tone, and he needed steel without echo. A diagonal shimmer shoved the wing. Ground effect broke unevenly where mangrove height dipped. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing under the left. Cole didn't snatch the nose up in panic. He held a line with trim and throttle and let speed rebuild instead of begging angle of attack. The jammed flap had changed the wing's shape to something with teeth. The airplane announced it every inch. Tanaka's palm hovered over the flap lever, muscles wanting to pull, brain knowing another tug would only tear confidence they didn't own. They crossed the line from trees to sea, sap cleared to salt, light brightened harsh. The air smoothed 1 notch as ridge thermals yielded to ocean's lazier pushes. 95 came and stuck like a late friend. Cole eased 300 feet per minute, generous on the gauge, thief in the gut. The twigs buzzed higher, an insect whine that reminded everyone that airborne isn't safe, it's only not ground. Tanaka squinted through the floorport at the left main gear, the leg that had hammered the rut hard enough to test a joint. The indicator told him what a reed tells wind, mostly tone. He tapped the gear lever, a question shaped like a touch. Cole shook him off, no changes yet. Geometry was their currency. For 2 minutes, maybe 3, they bought time in a straight line over hammered tin sea. The engines sang with a cough threaded through, the right even, the left clearing its throat. Tanaka trimmed mixtures a hair richer for cooling, watched fuel flow climb, compromise he hated and needed. Rourke abandoned conversation for pings, single words into haze that might catch a tower or a saint. In the back, the stretcher man sagged into straps, chest a careful bellows, sweat the kind that doesn't feel cool when you catch wind. She wedged a blanket to keep the IV honest and saw at the wing root a bead of sap run across a cracked rivet line and vanish into oil. Guadalcanal broke in with serrated clarity. Transport 4-1, cleared straight, wind 210 at 15, gust 20, report 3 mile. The phrase held enough. Crosswind quartering right on approach. Crab and kick, no drift allowed. 1 shot on coral that hated indecision. The final turn would be in variable wind with a gear that might lie and a flap that would. Cole shelved those for later and stacked speed in the now. They were flying. The jungle fell behind, with leaves still glued to skin, green made ridiculous by oil. Every gauge told a piece of truth and hit a fraction. Airspeed hung low 90s, sticky, unwilling to climb into 3 digits. The left wing's shiver wasn't anyone's nerves. It was drag-chewing performance with invisible teeth. Through the blister, Tanaka saw the left flap cocked near 10 degrees. The right had answered and then cleaned up. They were flying crooked to keep that secret from becoming a spin. Tanaka leaned out farther, harness biting his chest, eyes watering in oily wash. Green vibrated so close he could have plucked it and been pulled into 90-knot air. He yanked himself in, slammed the frame, breath loud over engines, and tapped the quadrant. More right rudder. The airplane wanted to pivot toward the wounded wing. They wouldn't let it. Cole's jaw worked on calculation. The turn and bank ball sagged right and stayed. His boot held it honest. The aft CG had turned rotation into a hair trigger. Now it turned bumps into swings. The yoke went woolly near stall, so he kept 2 degrees low, trading climb for speed as they skimmed mangrove. He ran a knuckle down the co-pilot's column, a ritual borrowed from a ghost, and set his hands again. Rourke pushed Bakelite into her ear. The radio stuttered like an old man with secrets. Guadalcanal. Cleared. Winds vary, then hiss, then a stray Morse chirp not for them. The HF lifted only sea roar that made the wounded man flinch. Heat climbed with them. She touched his shoulder and felt a fever keep pace. The fuel board chalk read 400 at start, revision by the minute. Numbers meant time. Time thinned. The next argument was metal and heat. Left cylinder heads ticked toward red. Tanaka set his palm over the cow lever and didn't close it, not fully. Drag was tax. They'd pay interest later. Cole cut him a look. Tanaka didn't blink. Better to burn gasoline than a motor. He opened a notch when the needle twitched. The airframe shuddered at the cost. That counted as one. The air beyond the coast looked flat. It wasn't. Convection off the black jungle built invisible steps and holes that slammed and let go. Each dip nibbled indicated airspeed into the wrong. The needle hunted at 95 and panicked lower when gusts arrived from bad quarters. Cole kept his hands quiet. The urge is always to yank. Discipline feeds, then waits for the wing to admit lift before asking for more. Wind worried them from the right. 12 knots steady, 15 in pulses. The nose crabbed. The left wing dragged with that stuck 10 degrees. The right flap cleaned. The left refused. Asymmetric lift meant constant rudder, constant yaw, and a tight line where the outboard left wanted to quit while the right begged to fly. Tanaka watched RPM needles for harmony, caught the left down 50, and nudged verniers into agreement. Fuel stopped being chalk and became weight. Drums had given them island with gasoline, water, grit, a little rust, and the estimator needle had the confidence of a liar. Tanaka knocked the glass, got the same lie, and did Chief's math. Time since lift, power set, drag guessed, ground speed slashed by crab. The alternate's cushion shrank to nil. He set best power mixture and believed his own arithmetic long enough to act. Guadalcanal, transport 27, mid-channel, 2 souls able, 1 stretcher, fuel anxious, request direct, Rourke called, voice level because panic wastes oxygen. Reply cut into pieces by storm-stacked static. Jock, straight in, wind 200 at 1. Then only crackle. She checked the stretcher rig. Breath whistled under morphine's wool. She tucked tags back in his shirt and wanted a human to say the runway would allow mercy. The afternoon cared for itself. They skimmed the coast, white surf against coral, water blue enough to mock heat. The airplane clawed out of ground effect and accepted a grudging climb. Cole kept low anyway, not for birds, for density. Low meant bite, meant an option to shove it back into ground effect if lift was stolen. Mangrove tops blurred like pelt. Leaves shredded in their wash and streamed aft. 200 feet up, the vibration changed pitch. Not engine, air. Tanaka popped up, peered through the fuselage mirror meant for ugly truths. He caught motion at the frame's sliver, the left wheel shivering at frequency. Not good. He remembered the rut and the hammer blow. Geometry seldom forgave. He sat back and hated sky for its indifference. The radio handed them another scrap. Guadalcanal field. Winds swinging 20 degrees, crosswind 15, gusts 18, cleared for straight in if capable. Rourke wanted the follow-up that static 8, otherwise go around. VHF had to claw through cumulus and ridge. HF was mood. DME and watch conspired with the fuel to say straight in wasn't style, it was the available. The airfield lay ahead like bone and sun, coral bright and unkind. The windsock twitched preferences, then changed its mind. Smoke to the north wrote an unstable sentence. Cole rolled his shoulders against fatigue older than him and slid a finger under his collar. Facts had shadows, rules carried asterisks. He eased the throttles a breath, felt the wing briefly kind, then lost the courtesy to a gust. He split his attention. Cowl flap levers, oil temp bars. The left cylinders demanded cold air. That gaping cowl did its drag penance. He preferred charts, The books were written for tame fields, not salt-sucked air that makes rubber go slack. He kept the left more open than any stateside instructor would bless, watched one grudging degree of relief, and felt range bruise. They coaxed best climb out of an airplane with no respect for best. 95 indicated showed, 90 threatened whenever sink took a bite. The diagonal gust that had saved them at treetop now harassed from beam. Cole's left calf burned with rudder work. Sweat pooled in forgotten places. He took 3 seconds to glance at the map on his knee and found home by ink like ink was anchor. From the back the stretcher moaned, a door in a bad house. Rourke braced him, even knowing reflex would be stronger than her hands. She checked the IV, flicked a bubble loose. The airframe trembled in a vocabulary she could almost read. Gust, engine note, flap flutter. She wanted to ask how bad. She saved breath and let the cockpit carry that weight. Coast unrolled, coconut stands, then scab dirt near pits that looked like sleeping monsters. They'd launched under the calculus of guns. Delay and shells walk toward you. Go and sky takes a swipe. Cole filed the choice where regret doesn't earn a seat. Regret is for after. The comm cracked with someone else's emergency, a fighter low on fuel declaring like a prayer. Rourke looked at their board and recalculated. Their burn was higher. Drag, rudder, heat paranoia earned right. The alternate turned to myth. Their world narrowed to one strip and one landing. Tanaka took mirror truth again. He teased the gear lever a half inch. Right down lock glowed. Left lamp stayed sulky. Filament live, meaning withheld. He opened the inspection port. The strut was there, but splayed a degree, like a boxer's knee after a bad turn. He closed, swallowed, and signaled facts with a hand steadier than he felt. They crossed the reef line. Spray misted the belly. Salt slapped their mouths. The approach would be crabbed. Crosswind demanded they be rude to centerline until the last breath. Cole rehearsed the kick and lower, crab out, into wind wing down, wheels straight. The stone under it, if the left folded on contact, everything would pivot toward the hurt, the side with jammed flap and leafy drag. He held the picture like it was a tool. The left engine coughed once, contaminated fuel licking the carb bowl. Tanaka enriched a notch and smoothed it. That cure cost a minute on a clock that had no minutes to spare. They shared a look. Baby it or ask of it. There's no second try. Wind's 210 now. Gusting. Guadalcanal's voice came bored or distant. Confirm gear down and locked. Bureaucracy met reality. Rourke pressed the key. Right shows down and locked. Left unsafe, attempting visual confirm. Attempt flattered the geometry. There would be no lazy downwind. There would be a straight line and an answer. Cole nudged the nose, accepted a crab that made the runway slide sideways, and built the last 10 seconds in his head. He eased power back carefully, felt sink, fed just enough to arrest, kept the ball near honest with left boot despite the airplane's contrary flap. A go-around here with asymmetric flaps, quartering gusts, and a fuel-licking left engine would be circus without applause. Perfect enough, or chalk on a board. Rourke told the stretcher man, low and tight, "Almost there," and he opened his eyes to slits, skin paper pale. She thought of crates, orders marked urgent, good weight loaded into a bad day. She blamed the calendar. Afternoons were unkind here. Leaves beat against rivet lines, ridiculous and undeniable. She pictured them still there on rollout and shook it off. She called altitudes, 504, coral a patchwork field. Tower repeated winds. She repeated back. Language became rope. They pulled hand over hand. Tanaka knew one thing needed before touchdown. Sort the truth of that leg now. He wriggled the port open, looking for a collar seat, a geometry line that meant yes. A shadow moved wrong. The emergency extension lived in reach, a manual crank to drive the leg down. He grabbed the handle that mattered when threads trumped pressure. Cole saw him reach and matched it. Straight-in clearance was a commitment he would keep. He brought the power up a thumb because time had to be found for a crank turned by a mechanic's arms inside a sky that didn't forgive. Fuel frowned. Coast slid by. In his peripheral, Green still hitched a ride. The headset hiss broke with a new instruction. Ground clutter midfield. Bulldozer parked left, crater repair ongoing, avoid. The strip had been shortened by chores and shell. Cole folded the hazard into his map, land long enough to clear equipment, short enough to stay on field. He blew out a laugh without humor and pulled focus. Tanaka seated the crank into the socket. Metal teeth met metal. He turned. Resistance like a conscience. Turned again, felt it move, counted revolutions, felt the airframe accept a new alignment. The left downlock light fluttered, then went dark. He couldn't swear the Paul was home. He could swear his forearms would hate him tomorrow. He stowed the crank and met Cole's eye with the second honest answer. Maybe. They were close enough to read old scuffs in coral. The windsock bent and then lied. Smoke wrote sideways grammar. Cole began to take the crab out, rudder ready, left wing low to fight the shove. Right wing asked for forgiveness. The jammed flap thumped an invisible pocket and asked for air they didn't have. He eased power back the smallest increment and watched the needle blink. Rourke laid a hand over the wounded man's fingers and let the absurdity pass. Dying with a tree and a wing is a headline nobody wants. She saved air for calls. Approach lights flickered through haze like eyes. Final 100 feet and no more time for second opinions. Tanaka dove for the port once more. The slit gave a stuttering picture, glint of metal, smear of sap, downlock arm wearing leaf pulp like camouflage, the strut shivering as if it wanted to fold and crawl back into the bay. "Looks down," he yelled, because cockpits need a noun, even if the mirror lies by a degree. Fuel needles crept toward paint. Wind flags walked sideways. Cole held the crab into hard right crosswind, windscreen peppered with salt freckles, horizon canted by necessity, fighter pilot picture in a transport that hated drama. 90 was the number he loved now, a hair above mush. He refused the big flare. Aft CG would turn nobility into a snap. Discipline was a straight line drawn through adrenaline. He traced it with tremor and throttle. Rourke watched surf break at the nose's edge, white like smoke blown sideways. Tower scratched. Straight in cleared, winds variable 1-5 right quartering, and the airframe took a sideways step that proved the words were theirs. She checked pulse, counted wobbles, pulled the belt snug, then slack by 1 notch. Too tight suffocates in a slide, too loose tumbles in a pivot. She picked a middle and owned it. The branch in the left flap had a voice now, a hiss that made the slipstream speak a different language, a tickle at the yoke. Tanaka's right foot buried in rudder, trimming what flaps wouldn't. Left cowl stayed wider than right, ugly drag to keep the head temp from cruelty. He wouldn't cook a Pratt for elegance. That was his second cowl choice and last. Darkest point arrived quiet. Contaminated fuel made the left engine sag, RPM dipping then bouncing like it too had doubts. Coal eased mixture richer, drowning grit and gasoline. The engine swallowed and went smooth. The slope cost. "Short," Tanaka said. Short wasn't runway. It was where they sat on the glide. Any flare would trade air they couldn't spare, drag it in with power, and a diagonal gust would throw math into mangroves. Cole tightened his hand until the quadrant knurling printed his skin and fed in a thumb's worth more thrust to hold the picture, and nothing extra. Go-around lived for classroom air. Here it was, fantasy, half-stuck flap, quartering gusts, fuel near whispers. The fighter overhead could call wind shift. Their VHF was mood, not certainty. The book from home would say low pass to feel the gear. There was no time, no fuel, no pattern grace in this crosswind. Cole glanced right. Clean cowl, better thrust. Then left. Leaves like a torn green flag. And then, at the threshold, coral, bright as teeth. He chose the choice he'd promised he wouldn't. Power on, hold the crab, arrive in drift, keep the wing flying until tires made claim. Either the left leg would accept life soft, or it would scissor. Movement either way. New air revealed itself along the beach, a warm ribbon running with the shoreline, a micro-eddy thrown up by heated coral. Ground effect here would be a thin cushion for 3 beats, but asymmetric flap would warp it. Over left, mush magnified. Over right, smoothed. Cole read it through the yoke like Braille. He held the crab and counted 1, 2, breath. Wind now 20 right, gusts 2-2, Rourke called, metronome steady, a slip of clarity between static. She eyed the mirror again. The left gear jittered into a cartoon, truth half spoken. The stretcher man's breath rasped under belts. She loosened a notch and hated that she had to pick a side of a coin flip out loud. Tanaka wrapped his fingers around the emergency handle without pulling. Hold the option, don't invoke it. One yank might unlock what a load had just bullied into place. He glanced at water lacing the runway end. Foam hissed beside coral like a kettle boiling. He knew splash distance by memory. A bomber had misjudged this same yard and paid in metal. The picture was close enough to touch. They squatted into ground effect across the mangrove bar. For a second, the leaves stuck in the flap seemed to whisper to their cousins below. The gust had them on a leash now, tail tugged hard, asking for a correction the ship couldn't give without rolling into the drag. Cole danced on pedals in millimeters, not inches, aligning the wheels to meet coral with axes already pointed down track. Airspeed trembled at 87. He believed numbers, not fear. The left engine burped again, not water now, but an oil-wet plug missing a beat. Torque pulled them left toward the parked bulldozer that had already stolen runway. Sun-bleached yellow sat fat and indifferent, blade a cleaver. Cole did the math that hurt and took a hair off the left throttle. Sync increased, nose came right, line cleared by arm's length, and faith. Flare, Tanaka said, because someone had to place the word. Not the cinematic lift, just enough to let mains think the ground had risen. Cole pulled with 2 fingers, and the aft CG quirk tried to pitch them more than requested. He checked it with forward pressure, so light it was almost thought. 85 flashed. Ground effect held like a mother who can't let go. They skated 3 coral slabs, each throwing light back up. The left gear met coral and spoke in metal. A bark, not failure yet, not triumph. Load, then lift, a spring offering weight back. The bounce tempted him to pin it, slam the nose and make it commit. He denied it, pushed too hard, and you start a pitch oscillation with a tail that wants to fly. He held the nose, let the airplane skip, and cut drift with right rudder by degrees. Rourke felt the skip as a tug across her belt and the wounded man's grunt under it, half pain, half relief. A blissfully normal phrase cut through, 3-4, continue, then garble. White centerline flashed under as blur. Through the side, sap-stained leaves peeled off in confetti. For a beat, the war was a garden's mess on aluminum. She braced for the sideways wrench if the left folded anyway. Tanaka kept one eye on the downlock through the slit because superstition feels like control. The arm stayed where geometry says right, jitter resolving into the normal shake. Scissor links did their quiet sums. He let breath out and floated his hand over the throttles, ready to pour them closed like tea. The left cowl still gaped like a wound. He anthropomorphized because it kept him honest. The bulldozer slid past right by hand's breadth, chipped paint, and stuck coral dust visible. Cole eased the crab into alignment, a slip now. Nose came straight as he swept the pedals through neutral. Tires chalked a smear, but no squeal. The airplane took the compromise, handshake over wrestle. First bounce rolled into second contact, Less argument, more agreement. Then the crosswind didn't just gust, it punched. A convective shove tried to weathercock the fuselage left. The wing dipped toward brush that would grab. The left leg took load that would decide if Tanaka's maybe would graduate to was. Rudder ran out. Cole took the last card. Right brake. Training calls it sin. Today, sacrament. He squeezed slow until friction bit. Nose came, left wing lifted a whisper. The branch in the flap sang. A fresh reveal came in his hands. The yoke stopped fighting as hard. Fuel slosh had crept forward just enough to shift leverage, easing tail's mischief. He borrowed that fraction and stared down the next hazard. The end, coral heaped in a repair pile. Loose stone turned small wheels into saboteurs. Pile, Rourke shouted, the wrong word first, then the right in her head, but too late for lips. Tanaka's fingers floated over throttles in case a skip turned to air. Cole already chose land only. Right brake murmured. Left ran true. The lock held under loads and stayed, not a lie. Coral rushed up in a white glare that made everything look aflame. Wind rotated 20 degrees without warning, crosswind becoming tail. Straight in changed dare. Cole could yank, go flying with no runway left and a limp engine, or hold crab in the shove and trust that downwind ground speed would not outrun leg patience. Training said one. Fuel said none. The stretcher's breath said now. They lined up, crabbed over coral, betting on a single shot with a maybe-locked leg and a snagged wing. Crosswind shoved hard from the right. Surf strobe diagonal proof. Cole kept the nose into it, left wing heavy with that stuck 10 degrees, hands off the gear switch because there'd be no time for anything but flying. The runway flashed patched sections and the crater's bruised oval. The bulldozer sat like a dare far side. He carried a hair more power than any manual would bless, because best anything was theory here. Real numbers were wind, sap, sweat. He told himself, throw it down at the threshold, ride the length, no float. Rourke had the handset off because VHF was a smear. She sent the idea forward with her eyes. Wind had swung. Tanaka reached under the right seat, popped the inspection plate, hunted the round mirror's slice, swore softly. The left leg was down and canted in the slipstream, tire wobbling in the shake the damaged flap made, and the lock tab that should sit proud wasn't proud enough to make sleep. He ratcheted the emergency lever, dry clicks under engine thunder, and watched the tab creep a hair, just a hair, then stop. He set his hand on Cole's shoulder with a half promise and a cost. Seconds stretched into a palm fronds bend and tear as they crossed shoreline. Left cowl still gaped because the head temp lived high. Drag taxed, they paid. That choice held, no third cowl talk. Cole felt mush at 85. He planned an arrival, not a romance with flair. A dozen maxims would get broken for the one that mattered. Wheels on ground before lift evaporates. Leaves still stuck in the flap were marks now, where lift had been bought, borrowed off canopies and ground effect at treetop. Seeing them whipped green against riveted metal made Cole measure the thinness of air under them. He banked 2 degrees into wind, aimed the fuselage down the paintless center, then kicked straight before tires met dirt coral mix. The asymmetric flap tried to yaw them anyway. His right foot recalibrated, a season learned in a second. He ignored the slip-skid ball and watched the bottom of the world. Touchdown wasn't a kiss. Right gear slapped and bounced. Suspension groaned. Left came down heavy, chirped once, then tried to fold. A pulse, a test, something in the bayonet lock took a set under pain. Cole nudged the nose down to pin because the tail still smelled sky. He bled a breath of right power to keep the left wing honest, an ugly habit that demanded finesse. Tanaka cut eyes from mirror to blur to the spear of green at the wing root and yelled a syllable that was warning and prayer. The left leg either locked truly or they'd plow. Skip. A short hop, not flight, just weightless enough for the wind to bite. Nose wanted to weathercock. Tires hadn't claimed enough friction. Cole fed a whisper more right power. Any more, and they'd yaw. Any less, and they'd tip. Runway edges came up in peripheral, coral to dirt that would grab and roll. The bulldozer swelled into profile they weren't meant to meet. Rourke held the stretcher steady and picked a stance that would keep her from becoming a missile. Brakes had to be a conversation, not a scream. Cole squeezed and released in rhythm, bled speed without courting a skid. The nose gear quivered like a bird on a twig. Sap and fuel smeared into a green-black tail on the wing, beautiful if it weren't a ledger of mistakes. The needle fell through 60, the tail settled, the airplane lost its yearning to fly. The left wing still tugged, the left gear groaned but stayed a hinge, not a surrender. Tanaka glanced at the slit and shouted, "Tab seated now." Load had driven the lock home. He slid attention to throttles. Cole needed a smooth drawdown. The cowl gaped. It could gasp. Ahead, the bulldozer's blade slid past with inches to spare, chipped paint and tool scars plain. Cole straightened fully, wheels chalking a light smear, and rode a second contact that felt like agreement. Crosswind punched one last time. Tail weather-vaned left, wing dipped, rudder died out. Right brake again, gentle and sufficient. The nose came. The branch in the flap hummed, green beating time against metal. The end of runway repair pile climbed into view. Coral stones loose like knuckles. Rocks, Rourke corrected herself, useless to say, and then felt the nose already dip in recognition. Tanaka hovered over the levers. If a bounce turned to air, he'd shove. Cole stayed committed to earth. Right brake murmured, left ran true. Lock held. Coral went sun-white and then under them. They made rollout before they ran out of runway, but the margin wasn't grace. Cole pulled mixtures to ground lean. The left coughed like a man swallowing a wrong thought. Rourke told Tower where they were. The reply sounded ordinary. Taxi to hardstand 3. Ordinary tasted good. The crosswind still leaned, but ground machine now, it did less harm. Tanaka left the left cowl open, shut down heat spike, kills as surely as misjudged wind. Turning at the far end slow, brake pivot to favor the left, they met mechanics already trotting, coveralls gray with coral dust, sleeves rolled, cigarettes in ears, faces open. They didn't run to transports for glory. They ran to problems. The problem presented itself like a joke from a harsh god. A full branch, leaves limp, green as yesterday, wedged in at the wing root and flap track, vibrating like an animal's flank. For one beat, silence. Trees belong on ground. Then chatter. Jesus, and how, and you ever, and nobody had. Tanaka held one more choice. Left cowl open at shutdown? Close it, and the trapped heat spikes with branch near a hinge. He let wind run draft through one more minute to give the head a kindness he hadn't in air. His jaw unhooked a hair. He looked at the flap track, twig wedged just so, metal that wanted to ripple, held in check by accident wood. He pictured the other storyboard. If that twig had sheared 3 minutes earlier, the flap might have walked out farther, and the lift would have dropped off into yaw and dirt. Cole pulled mixtures back, props slowed, blades chopping thicker and thicker air until only heat clicked off metal. Quiet made leaves louder, ticking against aluminum with a delicate noise that didn't belong to war. The cockpit smelled of sweat, sap, oil, a lick of acetone from a rag under Tanaka's seat. Memory took shape. Rourke unlatched and slid to the stretcher, touched the wounded man's shoulder with 2 fingers, and saw presence where glassiness had been. He whispered, if that bump was landing or him. She told him both, and made it kind. Medics folded and lifted, ducking under green like a treehouse had grown wings by mistake. One cursed when a leaf brushed his cheek. Landscapes were supposed to stay put. Mechanics orbited closer, hands already reaching. They tapped the branch at sap-glossed paint, probed the bite where wood met metal. Then the crew chief lifted his palm. Wait, don't pull until it's photographed. Reports would ask, how did a plane land with a tree lodged in its flaps without tearing itself? They needed pictures. The triage came plain. First, brace the left gear externally, a quick triangle of timber and chain, to keep loads honest before anyone changed the way metal held itself. Photograph everything: branch angle, leading edge scar, flap track position, cowl hinge clearance. Only then tug the branch, slow side to side. Pull straight and you tear skin. Leave it overnight and sap glues you married. A runner sprinted for a handsaw, wedges, a water can to wet leaves so they'd slip instead of crack. Cole stayed near the nose and kept his palms on cool curving metal. The branch didn't give easy. It had clawed into aluminum and held by friction and bent track. Tanaka pulled while a mechanic lifted the flap a hair, nothing in a manual for detreeing a wing. The release came soft, a damp cork. Wet leaves flashed smell and green. The flap drooped a degree and then held, track bent, skin buckled, no rupture. Sap left a line they'd scrub later. Today it testified. Tanaka ran a fingertip along the gouge, then took a pencil and wrote what mattered on a clipboard. Left flap, stuck, Shutdown, right clean, asymmetry carried with rudder and power, left cowl open for CHT, fuel burn high, left downlock confirmed under load after extension, no positive light on approach, emergency crank used, straight in with quartering 12:15, bulldozer avoided, crater midfield. A fuel truck wheezed up like a punchline, and Tanaka waved it off until bracing was complete. Under the wing, he traced the twig's path through the track, the little ripple where aluminum surrendered shape and still held. He pointed. This is where it jammed. This is where it saved us from worse. He underlined because detail will be all they carry to the engineers. They taxied slow on the brace, chocks in, a guard posted. The photographer crouched and framed the impossible. Workhorse paint chalked in salt and dust, a living green branch protruding from a bomber gray wing, leaves trembling in the prop wash as if they were waving. He asked Tanaka to set a hand on the throttles for scale. Knuckles were still pale. The shutter clicked once, twice. Mechanics talked the next steps through, without looking up. Replace the bent track by evening if spares, or cold straighten and ferry to depot if not. Check the left strut for splay with a plumb line before any taxi turn right. Ream the emergency jack threads. They'd felt rough. Rourke stepped off onto coral and dirt, wind tugging her hair, and looked back down the approach she'd watched through a side window. White surf, diagonal spray. She thumbed the radio and cued the gear and fuel note for the shop. The tower wanted their report in 10. The surgeon wanted their stretcher in 1. Choices nested. They started with the one breathing. The crew chief raised the saw. Sap smell sharpened under oil and hot metal. Cole nodded at the brace, then at hardstand 3. They'd move her with a tug, not under her own power, not until a downlock was honest in daylight. Tanaka slid the inspection port shut with care and tapped the tab for luck he didn't say out loud. Rourke waved the medics into shade and keyed the set to file fuel contamination and crosswind gust data while it still felt in her wrist. Rubber boots squeaked on coral. A cigarette ash flaked off in the wash. The saw bit, and the branch shuddered against rivets in a small, clean sound that belonged to neither forest nor hangar. And while green bled sap and the wing ticked as it cooled, the next decision reached them in the form of a sergeant with a clipboard asking one simple thing over the noise. Flyable by morning or tow to depot. What do you want to risk?